This is the Enjoyer Podcast. I'm your host, James Dixon.
Friends, Detroiters, Michiganders, lend me your ears. I come to bury George Floyd, not to praise him. If you are unfortunate enough at this late date to still be consuming mainstream media, then you learn this Memorial Day weekend that George Floyd is still a hero in some circles. Many circles. The murals bearing his face still stand from coast to coast. The images or the statues bearing his images still stand from coast to coast. 5 years later, we're living in George Floyd's America and George Floyd's Michigan, and we are worse for it. And if we're not intentional about unwinding the George Floyd effect, we'll still be living in George Floyd's America decades from now. I refuse to do that. We deserve better. Our kids deserve better. And so if you or someone you know is still racked with white guilt over George Floyd's death, or maybe they've taken on a spirit of black entitlement after it, this podcast is for you. This podcast is for them, because on this podcast, I'm here today to knock that chip off your shoulder now and forevermore. George Floyd is not a man to be praised, and in my vicinity, he won't be. In yours, he cannot be. Not if we want to be a proper country. Not if we want to be a pleasant peninsula. Just for background, for those of you who may not have been around back then, George Floyd died of an overdose while in custody of Minneapolis police on May 25th, 2020, Memorial Day. The whole thing started when Floyd took fentanyl, then passed a fake 20 at a convenience store. What you saw of it, the 9 minutes of a knee on a back, would not have killed any normal person who was not on opioids. Back when I was a Detroit news reporter, I used to write a lot about opioids. What I learned is the way an opioid user dies is the drug turns off the receptors in their brain that tell them to breathe. This means that if you know someone who's addicted to heroin or fentanyl, they literally want that high more than they want to breathe. They want to get that feeling more than they want to draw their next breath, and they'll risk it all for that feeling. If you know this about opioids, then what happened to George Floyd made perfect sense. It's the kind of thing that would happen when you take a drug that depresses your breathing and your breathing is depressed further. If you don't know this, then you might look at Officer Derek Chauvin using a police academy trained technique, his colleague standing sentry, and you might see a murder most cruel. And that's what you were meant to think. If you believe that now, or if you ever believed that then, the psy-op worked. Friend of the program, Liz Collin over at Alpha News in Minnesota, showed in her movie The Fall of Minneapolis that the stance Derek Chauvin took is exactly what they train in police academy. But cops lied on the stand and said otherwise, and that perjury was allowed to stand. Everything that happened to Derek Chauvin was based on a calculated and decided miscarriage of justice. This was not people trying their best but making a mistake. This was the powers to be in Minnesota who saw George Floyd's death as politically useful and found in the cops on the scene the scapegoat they needed. And so when protesters overran the Minneapolis Police 3rd Precinct, City Hall told the cops to flee rather than stand their ground, rather than defend their turf. Cops weren't even allowed to wear tactical gear or bulletproof vests. So you had cops in blue t-shirts, basically, who were forced to flee protesters who were throwing rocks. As if Derek Chauvin and his colleagues were not enough of a sacrificial lamb, the Minneapolis police were forced to surrender a precinct. George Floyd had died, and the cops deserved to pay for it by any means necessary. And so for Democrats like Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey or Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, disorder is all part of their plan. Disorder is why Minnesota was made the Somalia of the Midwest. Disorder is why they changed the state flag. Disorder all fed into the idea that America was bursting at the seams under Donald Trump and would need regime change to be saved. And so what we saw in 2020 was a color revolution. It's the kind of thing America would normally do in a place like Ukraine. 81 trillion ballots later, Joe Biden was installed as president. The George Floyd psy-op was essential in that. Running simultaneous with COVID, it was the perfect cocktail of confusion. People who were in their right mind would eventually have rebelled at the idea that all 10 million people of Michigan need to stay home for the flu. Or that Juneteenth, the holiday based on slaves in Texas learning of their freedom, is the best response to a guy dying in Minnesota of a drug overdose. But oddly, when you put the two together, people asked even less questions. It's like their minds were overwhelmed. And this is why we talk about history so much and why we have to learn from history so we don't repeat it. The next time someone tells you the world needs to stop spinning for 15 days, be sure to ask what will happen on day 16. And their lack of answers is going to tell you everything you need to know. They don't have a plan. Their plan is to see how much they can get away with and how much you'll let them get away with. The next time some guy dies in police custody, maybe ask what he did to contribute to the situation. George Floyd was from the hood, sure, but he was never a candidate for sainthood, and right-thinking people would have never elevated him to that status. And yet, Joe Biden, when he was president, compared George Floyd's death and its impact to MLK. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi thanked George Floyd for sacrificing his life. In George Floyd, the left found someone to worship the way you or I might worship Jesus. This should have been your clue that it was no longer about knees on necks. It was about radical change by any means necessary, and in George Floyd, they found the vehicle for change. After Floyd's death, riots were sparked nationwide, instability reigned, and at the same time people were burning cities down, politicians like VP Kamala Harris, soon to be VP, were contributing to bailout funds. We were told that the riot was the voice of the unheard, that looting was a response to systemic racism, whatever that is. In Michigan, our biggest city, Detroit, didn't burn thanks to Police Chief James Craig, and thanks also to our own personal history with riots. When it's the 2020s and your city still hasn't recovered from a riot in 1967, and arguably not even from the one in 1943, you become yourself less likely to pick up a Molotov cocktail or to see it as a solution to your problem. It's actually the problem. To the extent people did try to get violent in Detroit, it was out-of-town protesters. It was rich white kids looking for street cred, and they didn't get very far when the natives got involved. But in Grand Rapids, in our state capital, Lansing, Whitmer had to call in the National Guard. George Floyd's death came 2 months after Whitmer declared COVID a state emergency. And this put the Gretchen Whitmers of the world in an awkward spot. In mid-May 2020, Whitmer warned anti-lockdown protesters that protesting could prolong lockdowns. She threatened to weaponize state government to punish people exercising their U.S. constitutional right to protest. Wrap that around your head. But by early June, in the days after George Floyd, Whitmer and Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan were marching alongside Black Lives Matter. There was no social distancing, which we also learned was a made-up and fake standard. With her words, Whitmer was telling us to fear the COVID virus, to stay home and stay safe. But with her actions, Whitmer was telling you basically, you'll be fine if you get it. The George Floyd effect in Michigan is not just historic. It continues to this day and will for decades if we don't stop it. To kill it, you must know it when you see it. 2 months after George Floyd died, Whitmer created an implicit bias training requirement for everybody in the medical field. This affects something like 400,000 people in Michigan who can't get or keep their jobs or get or renew their medical licenses without first attesting that they were a racist in need of saving. If you're the kind of Christian who considers yourself a sinner in need of a savior, you might seek out that savior in Bible study and at church. And you might hear in implicit bias training the Timu version. All it takes to be absolved of your social sins in this world is paying an obese woman to yell at you for an hour. In the early days of the pandemic, Whitmer spread a conspiracy theory, asymptomatic spread, that people could have COVID and spread COVID without knowing they have COVID. Whitmer used her stage, her bully pulpit, to tell people to assume they were sick. In the early days after George Floyd, Whitmer spread another conspiracy theory: implicit bias, that people could be racist and spread racism without knowing they are. Whitmer used public policy to tell people to assume they're racist. For a chiropractor like Garrett Saldano, who's in the middle of his career, he has no choice but to submit to the training. His livelihood depends on it. But for an elderly dentist like a Kern Wildern in Grand Rapids who was in his 70s, the training requirement was a bridge too far. He renounced his medical license rather than renew. But what if that was the point of it all, of all these George Floyd era regulations? To run off the people of conscience who might dare to buck the system, to keep other mavericks from ever joining the system, and to create a medical field where only the woke can thrive and survive. Let's think this a few years forward. If in 2025, every doctor in Michigan, every nurse, every medical practitioner of any kind is taking implicit bias training, what do you think is going to be happening by 2030? What do you think is going to be happening by 2035? I'll tell you, they'll be requiring you as the patient to do the same. And it'll all be based on the same false idea that racism and not fentanyl is what killed George Floyd. In April 2022, Grand Rapids police officer Christopher Schur pulled over a man named Patrick Lyoya. Lyoya, who came to America in 2014, ran off. Schur chased him and they fought. Schur pulled his weapon and killed Lyoya in self-defense. In any other time in Michigan's history, that's how it would have went, especially with body camera footage. But 2 years after George Floyd, with Michigan woefully absent from the racism gold rush that befell Minnesota, our Attorney General, Dana Nessel, wanted her own Derek Chauvin to sacrifice. And so before Kent County prosecutor Chris Becker ever made a charging decision, Nessel was lobbying publicly to take the case and questioning whether Becker's office, which works regularly with Grand Rapids police, was up for the job. When the case fell apart, Dana Nessel tried to minimize her involvement and even brought me into it. And that's when my brother, Jay-Z DeLorean, Jay Murray, showed on The Enjoyer that Nessel did everything in her power to make sure that Schur was charged and even wanted to be the one to charge him. Earlier this month, and 3 years later, after that traffic accident, after the fight, after the shooting that ended in a death, Schur beat the case on a hung jury. The jury leaned in favor of an acquittal, but it wasn't unanimous. Becker said he would not try the case again. Technically, Christopher Schur gets his life back. But he's lost his job. He's lost his good name. He's lost his livelihood, all in service of politics. Any sober reading of events or viewing of the traffic stop, viewing of the footage, would have found that Schur acted in self-defense without the need for charges, without the need for job loss. But when you see people's pain as politically useful, as it was in Minnesota, as Nessel wanted it to be in Grand Rapids, you see an opportunity in every tragedy. The fact is, it wasn't Christopher Schur's gun that killed Patrick Lyoya. It was the social programming of Black Lives Matter. It was the killer cop psy-op that killed him. Lyoya arrived in America in 2014. That's the same year Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, during a fight with Officer Darren Wilson. Black Lives Matter formed in the aftermath and then reformed after George Floyd. In both cases, Black Lives Matter was premised on a psy-op. You remember hands up, don't shoot? Turns out that the quote that the whole Mike Brown psy-op hung on was found to be made up. A Department of Justice report found that the quote was made up and fake. It was never said. But it shouldn't have taken the DOJ to notice that. Your own brain should have been able to get you there. Let's think this through. Hands up, don't shoot. Who's supposed to be saying all that? Mike Brown? So picture this. A cop has his gun pointed at you. Your hands are up. What do you say? Hands up, don't shoot? No, maybe my hands are up. Maybe don't shoot. But hands up, don't shoot sounds more like a mashup. Like Wilson might have said hands up and Brown said don't shoot. Something like that could have made sense. But that nobody felt the need to untangle this linguistic knot until it was too late, until Officer Wilson's life had been ruined, sums up the whole problem with Black Lives Matter and why it's a psyop and not a search for justice. Black Lives Matter has no credibility. They're willing to say anything if it advances their goals. After Ferguson, the Washington Post won a Pulitzer, creating a database of every incident in America where a cop killed a suspect. Even with this data crunch, the numbers actually told a positive story. Most police interactions end without harm to either side. Violence is relatively rare, and deaths are exceedingly rare. Deaths of unarmed men are rarest of all. And yet we've upturned society for events as likely as lightning strikes. But if you were to read the journalism that Leolia read, or view the TikTok videos that are probably in his stream, you'd see a different story told. Remember, this is someone who arrived in America in 2014, the year of Mike Brown. Such a person might actually think, given the overheated media they've been reading, that every police interaction is a matter of life and death. The psyop would certainly lead you to think that. What weakens that argument in Leolia's case is his many run-ins with police, all of which he had survived, except the last one where he chooses to reach for a man's taser and break out from a traffic stop, and God knows what's going to happen then. But what weakens the argument about the killer cop in general is our prison population. In Michigan, we still got about 30,000 dudes locked up, and if I had to guess, more than 20,000 of them are black men. So if every black man was a traffic stop away from death, we couldn't possibly have tens of thousands of black men in prison and many more nationwide, right? I mean, obviously. So we have perception and reality that are starkly at odds. Patrick Leolia died because he didn't have anyone in his life who could shepherd him toward the truth. He was so fearful of a life and death struggle with the cop that he created one and died in it. This was a tragedy, and it should have been a teachable moment. What should have happened after Leolia is what should have happened after Mike Brown, but never did. Get white cops and black men in rooms together nationwide. Because what the black kid's mom fears is what the white cop's wife fears. That knock on the door from men in suits offering condolences. But if you put those guys in a room together, and the black man and the white cop and the black mom and the white wife saw the common humanity in each other, there would have been no need for databases or donations or regime change. Black Lives Matter wouldn't have raised and then wasted $90 million. But the psyop was too useful for solutions, so no solution was ever offered. The psyop was supposed to perpetuate itself. And so the George Floyd effect cost 2 Michigan men, Patrick Leolia and Officer Christopher Schur, the lives they knew and loved. That is 2 lives too many. How many more do we need before we reject this poison of weaponized racial division? Racial psyops that say it's unsafe for you as a black man to drive a car. It's simply not true. Why do people want you to think that? If there is one piece of good that resulted from George Floyd's death, it's this. It cost Gretchen Whitmer her chance at ever becoming president. Go back and watch those Whitmer press conferences from March and April 2020. Big Gretch was doing everything in her meager powers to earn an invite to be Joe Biden's running mate. She even delayed the announcement of the COVID virus until the night of the Democrat primary so Biden could win and keep his momentum. But when George Floyd died, that changed the calculus. Biden already said he was going to pick a woman. That decision, along with Whitmer's rising profile after Trump called her that woman from Michigan, it all fared well for the governor, who also photographs well. But after Floyd died, there was a new rubric added. It had to be a black woman. Big Gretch isn't that. And so there was only about 3 women to speak of who were on the national stage in any meaningful way. You had Kamala Harris, who years earlier had celebrated being the first Indian elected to the U.S. Senate, but now in time for the 2020 Democrat primary had become a black woman. There was Stacey Abrams, who does not photograph well and has no political wins to speak of. Then there was Michelle Obama, who's been wearing a sourpuss and playing the victim card for 15 years. With roughly 3 options to choose from and no good ones, Biden picked the only one with a track record who also photographed the best, Kamala Harris. Whitmer was forced to watch it all from Lansing, a bridemaid, not a bride. Biden had also promised to be a one-term president. That means that whoever he would pick for VP would be in a strong position going into 2024. But then Biden broke that promise and tried to run again. When he finally did drop out of the race, only after Donald Trump was shot in the head and didn't die, his heir apparent, Kamala Harris, was elevated. Without any vetting, without any vote, without anyone even asking her, hey, Kamala, are you even up for doing this? If not for George Floyd's death, it would have been Gretchen Whitmer who was elevated without vetting, without a vote. And no one would have needed to ask if Whitmer was up for it. She damn well is. So if I can say that George Floyd did any good in this world, it was that. It was costing Whitmer what was going to be her best shot at the presidency. I can sit here and tell you honestly, I would trade George Floyd's life for Gretchen Whitmer in the White House any day of the week. But in the end, the George Floyd effect has made Michigan an uglier, stupider, less safe, and less trusting place. The George Floyd effect must be repealed with all deliberate speed in January 2027. I'd start by removing holiday status from Juneteenth. This never made sense for Michigan. We're a non-slave state. We've never played that. I'd continue it by ending implicit bias training that enriches leftist nonprofits and alienates normal people from the health field. But your real challenge is internal. It's not a matter of public policy. Your real challenge is, how do I prevent the next psy-op from taking root in my own mind? And you do this by questioning everything as it happens, especially when there's video. You don't have to wait months and years. We don't have to wait for courtroom testimony. You just have to use your eyes. What should have been clear to you, though, is that George Floyd died for his sins, not for ours. If you ever thought otherwise, that's a you problem. If we had had the courage to speak the truth from day one, the Michigan we once knew would still be pure, would be untainted by the racial animus that's wafted over from Minnesota. But if you're not immunized and fortified from the next psy-op, you still haven't learned a damn thing from George Floyd. That would be the real tragedy.